This is Garis, Masculist, MGTOW flyers. That is 2 3-page essays on the themes of masculism and MGTOW, written by and read aloud by Prof. Dr. Hugo de Garis. This is flyer number 593, entitled The Masculist Paradigm Shift in Gender Politics. Description. This flyer claims that as masculist and MGTOW ideas spread right across whole populations, there will be a major gender political paradigm shift from monoconsciousness to biconsciousness, so that major institutions will need to be thoroughly restructured. For example, the gender studies departments in universities, thousands of them across the planet, and the gender equality committees in parliaments, hundreds of them, so that these institutions see the world through biconscious eyes and not today's supremely biased, ignorant, monoconscious eyes. Producing this gender political paradigm shift will probably require a lot of vicious verbal blood to be spilt as biconscious masculists attack monoconscious feminists, teaching them of the error, bias and bigotry of their ways. Now the flyer itself. The Masculist Paradigm Shift in Gender Politics by Prof. Dr. Hugo de Garis. Email profhugodegaris@yahoo.com. Website profhugodegaris.wordpress.com. A paradigm shift in the scientific context is a major change in the way one views a topic, a change in Weltanschauung, as the Germans say, that is, a change in world view. For example, religionists and seculars have very different world views. A more scientific example of a paradigm shift would be the way the geologists started seeing the continental plates shifting slowly over the Earth rather than being fixed and eternal, or the way Darwin showed that species evolve and become extinct rather than were put there unchangeable by God, as seen by the religionists. So why am I talking about a masculist paradigm shift? To use the term paradigm shift implies a major change, a revolution in the way one sees the world. So what will be so revolutionary about the rise of masculist ideas in the context of gender politics? ? The answer to this question can be found by reflecting on the enormity of the feminist industry that has been built up over the past 6 decades since the rise of the second wave of the feminists. Consider what they have done. Ask yourself, how many universities are there in the world that have a gender studies department, which is the usual misnomer or doublethink for women's studies? The answer is probably thousands around the world. How many parliaments around the world have a gender equality committee or related organisations built into them? Probably several hundred. So all this gender political, that is feminist infrastructure, will have to be thoroughly restructured so that it deals equally with masculist issues as with feminist issues. Otherwise it will be severely criticised to death by very angry, hateful masculists who do not tolerate monoconscious feminists claiming that gender oppression is a one-way street, when the masculists, who are usually biconscious, know very well that it is not, since masculist ideas teach men very clearly how women oppress men for decades, with many of women's gender crimes against men. So the monoconscious hypocrisy and ignorance of MFBs, that's monoconscious feminazi bigots, is simply intolerable to biconscious masculists, who usually just bite the fucking heads off MFBs, aka shibbers, SHBRS. Shibbers equals sexist, hypocritical bigots, haranguing them with very angry, hateful, masculist ideas, telling these feminazi ignorami that women oppress men worse, because many of women's gender crimes against men last decades, making them a lot more serious than the relatively minor ways that men oppress women. To masculists, even rape, which is one of the worst ways that men oppress women, is small beer in comparison with the big three ways that women oppress men that last decades. That is, women's man-slavery, women's divorce rape, and women's forced fathering. Anyone reflecting a bit on any of these big three will realise what horrible gender crimes they are, and will readily understand why masculists have such a hatred of women who commit these horrific gender crimes against men. As masculist and MGTOW ideas spread and spread, pressure will mount on universities to change their gender studies departments to be real gender studies, that is, of two genders, male and female, rather than be preoccupied with only one gender, that is female, that is feminist. A similar logic applies to the parliaments, which is one of the major political aims of the masculists, that is, to see the establishment of GECs, GECs, gender equality committees, in the parliaments that consist half of female feminist politicians and half of male masculist politicians, so that the gender issues of both sexes are dealt with equally. Masculists today are fed up with the utter hypocrisy and monoconscious ignorance of the gender equality committees that exist today in the parliaments, since they are so obviously monoconscious and biased, suffering the delusion that has been drilled into them by feminist thinking that gender oppression is a one-way street, when in fact women oppress men worse than vice versa. For example, as seen with the big three ways that women oppress men. To masculists, the worst of all gender crimes, in either direction, is women's man-slavery, which the masculists see as 1,000 times worse than was Negro slavery, given the numbers. There are several billion man-slaves in the world today, compared to a few million Negro slaves in the US in the slave period. Masculists have a real hatred of fluffy, man-slaving, divorce-raping, parasite vermin who live off men's money and labour, who don't bother to fib up and expect that by merely wiggling her twat at some gullible, stupid, ignorant, man-slaveable man, she can persuade him to be her manslave, working for her for decades of his life, then divorce rape him by taking his kids, his house, half his wealth, half his stuff, be forced to make child payments to his kids, whom he will barely be allowed to see. And if his ex-wife is a real fluffy, he may be forced to pay her alimony for the rest of his life, with no moral nor legal obligation on her to get off her fat parasitic manslaving ass and fib up, so that she continues to manslave him after the divorce the way she did before the divorce. Masculists have a burning hatred of such manslaving, divorce-raping women, and punish them severely by effectively exterminating them, by totally ignoring them, not even pumping and dumping them. So as most men become masculisted, there will be no manslavable men left for fluffy manslavers to get their financial claws into. So these fluffies will rot on the shelf, hated, despised, spat at, utterly rejected, so that their fluffy manslaving genes are removed from the gene pool. That is, effectively exterminated, leaving only fit genes in the female population. By far the biggest change in terms of a gender political paradigm shift will occur in the general public, the millions, the billions, as masculist and MGTOW ideas spread right across whole populations, so that all men become masculisted and MGTOW'd in their ideas. So that if they hear some monoconscious feminist haranguing men publicly, then they will react like a bull seeing a red flag, and verbally, viciously attack her with masculinist anger and hatred, screaming at her for her monoconscious hypocrisy and ignorant bigotry, given that to any biconscious masculist it is obvious that women oppress men worse, and the fact that this feminist has not bothered to inform herself of masculist and MGTOW ideas makes her look like a gender political retard, a dinosaur, a fossil, who should be blown off the stage with a vicious masculist tirade for her awful hypocrisy. Life is not going to be pleasant for monoconscious feminists over the next few years as they are educated by biconscious masculists of the errors of their ways. As masculists lash into them for their monoconscious bigotry, their sexist hypocritical ignorance, their lack of empathy towards the sufferings of men at the hands of the horrible gender crimes that women commit against men. Millions of monoconscious feminists are going to have their heads bitten off by very angry, hateful, well-informed masculists over the next few years. So it is ordinary women in their millions who will feel the hurricane of the masculists. Millions of masculisted men will become increasingly angry and hateful at the very one-sided bias of today's gender political institutions, which are oriented towards only one sex, that is, women, due to the extremely biased, ignorant delusion of the feminists that gender oppression is a one-way street. It is particularly towards these MFBs, monoconscious feminazi bigots, who insist that gender oppression is a one-way street, that the masculists will be the most vicious, the most hateful, since these MFBs cause the GECs and the gender studies departments in the universities to be so feminist biased, when in reality gender oppression is very much a two-way street. So in short, expect over the next decade or so a wave of masculist paradigm shifting as society becomes ever more conscious that gender oppression is a two-way street and that in fact women oppress men more, so that today's monoconscious gender bias in the universities and the parliaments and society at large is seen as intolerable by the Masculists and MGTOWs. So expect a lot of verbal blood to be spilt over the next decade or so as the gender political paradigm shift occurs from monoconsciousness to biconsciousness. That will change society and the gender laws profoundly. Cheers. Prof. Dr. Hugo de Garis. Email profhugodegaris@yahoo.com. Website profhugodegaris.wordpress.com. Author of the book Masculism, Men's Rebellion Against Being Man-Slaves to Women, an e-textbook of 590 plus masculist flyers for men's studies courses, freely downloadable in Microsoft Word format from my website. Ciao.